So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay and to another battle on the new patch of the game. And as you can see, it's also going to be another showcase of a new map. We've seen Mordor defend their home turf on Cirith Ungol. We've seen the same of the Rhovanion and of Gondor with remakes of maps like Cirith Ungol and like Caer Andros. And today we're going to be seeing Dorwinion do much the same thing with the purple colour scheme that this settlement is clad in. Perhaps you could have already told that, but this is going to be the new version of CARAS SANT, the capital of Dorwinion, which has always existed in some form or another as a map within the game, though it was one of the more standard cityscape maps without its own unique architecture. And it's nice to see that some factions are getting access to a look which is unique to them in some of these maps as well. In the past, it's been much sort of hoarded, really, as a privilege only to some of the main factions like Gondor, Mordor, to a certain extent Rohan and Isengard as well. But it's nice to see a little bit more of this. Obviously, Fain Nobel as well, the capital of Harad, being given a similar sort of treatment. So we'll see how the Vinelanders do here. With regards to this settlement overall, it's a fairly standard city in the middle, but I think what really sets it apart is the raised bits of terrain, which are effectively in each corner of it, which are probably going to be just as useful as the outer fortifications in all fairness. And also the raised terrain means it's not just a huge square of a settlement which the attackers can try and overwhelm from many sides. There's still quite a lot of flat space for the attackers to take advantage of, but the terrain itself also acting as a natural defence intermingled with the man-made fortifications. Going to be a fairly interesting affair indeed. But we'll go through the attackers first and foremost, and unsurprisingly the bulk of the attackers being made up of by the Easterlings of Rhun, who we've seen a little bit of in this series of patch previews that we've been doing. For the most part, Rhun as a faction are not really going to be changing in terms of their overall focuses. It's going to be more sort of micro changes rather than macro ones with them. And the Scion Rim represent that really, because they're always going to be a heavy, more defensively minded spear unit to help offset the fact that many of their other units trade in a little bit of their survivability for a bit of extra armour piercing edge. The Scion Rim represent the defensive option that Rhun do have. 2 units of them under Froggy's command. Then the classic combination really of Gamp Rim and Flag Rim. It's a fairly expensive front line to field, all things considered. It's always going to be worthwhile if the opposing team are reliant on their armour. Of course, Dorwinion, it's a fairly linear split down the middle of their faction which units are and aren't reliant on armour, but it is going to be useful here nonetheless, because the numbers of Dorwinion really do come from their more heavily armoured human contingent, and these are the units against which the Eastlings will be pretty effective, although they will need to watch themselves against the more skill-minded elves, who are likely to be pretty effective as long as they can avoid getting caught on the front end of the phalanx that the Gamp Rim do provide. We also have the Carmel's Chosen back here. They've been given a bit of a remodel. In terms of their overall statistical performance, we'll have to wait and see, but they were always a relatively stock standard bodyguard kind of unit. They certainly look more impressive now, but Sword and Shield bodyguard units are not really going to be overwhelming in terms of their power. Generally speaking, they're going to be a little bit more dependable at keeping themselves alive with stuff like their shields, but we'll see. We'll see how they do against this kind of foe. We've got some Dragon's Wrath crossbowmen over here, who of course have got their shotgun-like splinter shot restored to them now, I believe. Going to be interesting to see how that works. I mean, it was always kind of difficult to get good shots off with them. They could potentially be super effective, but I feel like if the defenders are doing their due diligence, they shouldn't be allowing the Dragon's Wrath crossbows into position for them to be hyper-effective. We also have the Dragon's Breath cannon, going to be very useful, of course, for punching holes in the outer wall, which makes the initial defence of Dorwinion a little bit harder. They may have to fall back to the 4 corners of the settlement a little bit more quickly than they would like as a result of Rhun's artillery presence. Some standard E-Strong crossbowmen as well. I mean, standard crossbows we all know to be very effective if they are allowed to get into position, if they're allowed to dominate the walls and such. Again, this is where the terrain of CARAS SANT could prove to be very, very useful for the defenders. It means it's less likely that all the Eastlings need to do is claim the walls, and then they can claim range superiority. More Scion Rim over here. We've also got some chariots, interestingly enough, from Froggy as well. The Wain Riders. Chariots, of course, having their numbers greatly boosted, which will make them more useful. Certainly in open field battles, I feel like the chariots are going to be a little bit more handy, but getting caught in narrow city streets is still going to be pretty much a death sentence for them, so I don't know necessarily how useful they will be here. If Dorwinion get caught cold, there is a very reasonable assumption that they could clean up, but again, it's one of those situations where if the defenders are doing their due diligence, they shouldn't be allowing such things to happen. Then, the Kingdom of the Rhovanion, already perhaps conquered by the Easterlings, are going to be marching alongside them. They've been a little while since we've seen them, actually, interestingly enough. They are, of course, a new faction as well, one of a few that's going to be introduced in this new version of the game. Not unlike Dorwinion, they're split between two very differently minded groups of units. The tribal units here, more akin to the sort of thing you would expect to find in Harad or Rhudaur. Numerous, relatively lightly armoured and lowly defended, but fairly savage with regards to the damage they can do. And then the more heavily armoured human contingent, which is higher tier, more defensive, maybe not as good at dealing damage as units of equivalent nature from other factions, but they do represent the bulwark to help back up the more numerous units of tribals here. Tribal Levy Slingers, for example. Slingers are an interesting kind of unit with a relatively low missile damage score, but it is armor piercing, so once again, they can be surprisingly vicious, especially considering the amount of ammunition they have at their disposal. We've got some Rhovakin Hoplons as well. This is the heavy unit of spears, of course. More of a fixture in their army than the Scion Rim are in runes, perhaps. You're going to be a little bit more dependent on bringing more of these Hoplons in order to help form up an effective front line. They can take a good amount of punishment, and of course the anti-cavalry bonus is not to be sniffed at either. Rhovakin Nobles, in many ways, are actually very, very similar to the Carmels chosen over in Rhun, at least in terms of the kind of unit that they are. Heavily armoured, you know, very impressive units of sword and board infantry of a bodyguard nature. But again, the natural shortcomings of sword and board units at this level in terms of the amount of damage they can deal may be a little bit of a concern if you're looking for that showstopper unit to take you over the line, but they will make you harder to beat, most certainly. In the past, when we've seen the Rhovanion, one of their main ways of dealing damage, especially in melee, has been the tribal berserkers, maybe not too dissimilar to the likes of the Black Wolds from Rhudaur. Probably wouldn't go as far as comparing them to something like the Uruk-hai berserkers, but you can still see what kind of unit that they are. Savage in terms of dealing damage, but again, their defensive shortcomings can be an issue if the battle turns into a grindier affair, which the defenders will be wanting, of course. Rovirim Nobles, another unit of cavalry here, a very fantastic unit of lancers as well. Good at dealing damage, obviously the wings, no prizes for knowing where they are inspired from, but I don't know how effective lance cavalry is going to be in much the same way as the chariots. There could be an opening for them if the defenders are doing things properly. There shouldn't be, but perhaps it is worth it for Mr. Sneakman to have brought them. We have the Rhovakin Phalanx as well, heavily armoured and shielded pikes, representing really the centre of most Rhovanion forces. Very dependable, of course. If you can get your pikes down and braced, that street fighting is going to be just that little bit less painful for you. And then Tribal Levy Skirmishers as well, the javelin variant of the slingers seen just in front, adding to the numbers that they have. Now then, hopping across to the third attacking army, we have another runic force commanded by Sin. Dragon's Breath obviously having to cross over this moat here. In front of CARAS SANT, Flag Rim. I imagine it's going to be largely the same sort of thing, with Gamp Rim, Flag Rim and Scion Rim being the centre of the force. Dragon's Breath. We also have some Balkoth Tribesmen in here as well, so again, more close range punch, and I think based on the kind of settlement we're seeing here, javelins, while they may not have the higher ceiling that the crossbows do offer Rhun, I think they're going to be a little bit easier to use, and they're less risky as well on this occasion, so I can definitely see why Sin has decided to bring them. He has got the crossbows as well, of course, for that diverse selection of ranged units. More Carmels chosen and more Dragon's Wrath crossbows, so fairly high tier approaches here from Rhun. They're not going for a bunch of their low tier Eastrons, at least so far, instead going for a little bit more in terms of upfront quality, which is a risk, of course. Overwhelming numbers are one way in which the attackers often exert their dominance on a battlefield, and it looks like Mevin has gone for much the same sort of thing here with a largely Golden Boys dominated army. Again, we've got Balkoth Tribesmen, we have Scion Rim, we have plenty of Scion Rim in fact, Gamp Rim, Flag Rim, the centre, the triumvirate of units. We do have a unit of Carmel's Immortals, which is a lower end unit which has replaced the Eastron Warriors. Carmel's Immortals, I don't know if they're locked morale or what, but they obviously are going to be a little bit more vulnerable to arrow fire with that lack of a shield, but they could find their niche here. You know, the elves will still cut through them, but they will at least be a little bit more of an annoyance based on the kind of unit that they are. Dragon's Wrath crossbows, and once again, the resplendent looking Carmels chosen. So now then, let's go into CARAS SANT itself. Add-in men, playing as one of the Dorwinion defenders. Morroquendi bows. Dorwinion, interestingly enough, are another one of these factions which are not going to see a great deal of changes, sort of smaller changes, much like Rhun. Because largely their faction focus was already set, and they had a smaller array of units, but they did their job really. The Morroquendi bows being one such example. Decent in melee as any elven archer of this level is going to be. They're maybe a little bit less impressive in melee than their equivalents from Lothlorien and Mirkwood and Imladris, but they do have the poison projectiles, so it swings and roundabouts really, and the anti-cavalry thing is also quite nice, although in a siege battle like this doesn't tend to be the be-all and end-all, but there is cavalry present, so we'll wait and see. Elvelyn marksmen are a little bit more well known for being that skirmishing archer because of their more heavily armoured nature and their cheaper nature as well. They're not quite as luxurious perhaps as the Morroquendi we've seen before, lacking the poison projectiles as well. But the Elvelyn marksmen, as far as a heavily armoured human archer goes, are definitely very dependable, and considering the virtually no long-range projectiles that the attackers have decided to bring here, utter domination from afar is something Dorwinion can take for granted here, so actually the heavily armoured nature of them is going to be maybe a little bit more incidental than it normally is. Nandor Glade Guard, they are a unit with very clear weaknesses. They're not the best in terms of surviving. Even for an Elven unit, they do lack a little bit of the, or at least they have done in the past, lack a little bit of the melee defensiveness that a lot of the Elven units and Elven two-handers tend to possess. And obviously their very light armour scores means that projectiles are often a problem, though like I said, no archers for the attackers make that less of a concern, or at least no archers we can see. There could be stuff like shadow bows after all. But very big charge values, very, very damaging as well in the right sort of situation, and they could be very, very useful here if they can get some good charges off into the runic infantry as it advances, a couple of units of them there. Morroquendi pikes will be able to outrange the plentiful amount of Gamprim that are on the attack. It'll be interesting to see which one will be able to dominate the street fighting between themselves and the Rhovakin phalanx. The Rhovakin phalanx, of course, more heavily armoured and shielded, though Elven pikes do have a tendency to be a little bit more damaging than your average unit of pikes as well. So interesting. Of course, it can't just be left down to a slogfest. The defenders will have a little bit of an edge when it comes to setting up their positions as well, but we'll see. Elvelyn infantry, very stock standard this. This is the kind of unit which probably will struggle against the vast majority of runic units, and actually a fair amount of the armour piercing that the Rhovanion have as well. Normally they are a very dependable kind of unit for the same reasons the marksmen. They don't have any frills on them really, but they are a very sturdy kind of unit, good stamina on them as well. But armour piercing will be a concern for them against the kind of foes they face now. More Elvelyn infantry over here, plenty of them. You'd expect that though, helps pad out the numbers a little bit, and numbers superiority is not something the attackers can fully rely upon here. Tundrous Fox, another defender with Morroquendi bows. This higher section of terrain not yet occupied by many Dorwinion forces. We have a few more over here by the front gate, Elvelyn infantry, backed up by the Vine Guard as well, the spear variant. Of course, spears do have their advantages in terms of holding a line. They're going to be less damaging, but the Elvelyn's sort of primary goal is never really going to be damage dealing anyway. It's to be the reliable front line for other units in Dorwinion to do the damage. Morroquendi pikes are also here to help shore things up. Marksmen also. More infantry just in behind. Vine Guard, Morroquendi pikes, Nandor Glade Guard, and River Patrol. River Patrol are an interesting one, of course. They do now come furnished with a shield, so again, that's useful against the kind of units that the attackers have not brought because they lack archers on this occasion, but still. The fact that they do have some javelin men here is also going to be a fairly good answer to the Balcloth tribesmen they're inevitably going to have to face. Morroquendi bows, we do have some cavalry here as well, in and amongst the Elvelyn, the Nandor Glade Riders. Very fragile unit of cavalry, much like the footbound version. They are very, very damaging off a charge, which is rare, at least in the last version of the game, for cavalry like this. Of course, I do have to put my preconceptions about the previous versions of the game cavalry aside for this, and we'll give the Glade Riders a fair shot at it, but I would expect them to still carry the burden really of being fairly fragile, so timing is going to be really everything with regards to utilising this unit of cav. We have some Morroquendi bows at the top here once again, already occupying this corner of the settlement. We have Alexios 22, another Dorwinion defender here, with more Elvelyn marksmen. More Elvelyn marksmen, we've got Morroquendi pikes, a huge amount here, causing the frame rate to stutter just a little bit. Vine Guard and infantry, and there's also some Nandor Glade Guard, Morroquendi pikes. Nandor Glade, or Morroquendi Glade Lords, a couple of units of them, Alexios and Eclipse 2500, bringing some pretty hefty firepower to bear here. Obviously, as far as knights go, they are probably one of the more well-rounded units of knights that the game has to offer, being able to take advantage of that elven defensive ability in melee. Having said that, they don't have quite the same armour values as something like the Imladris version of this cavalry, so it is swings and roundabouts once again, but still, it's a sort of cavalry unit which will be able to dominate in most engagements that it picks really outside of the settlement, but they will need to concern themselves with pikes and crossbows and spears and the like out there. We'll see. Cavalry is always a risk, but if it pays off, it can be very, very lucrative indeed. More Helvellyn marksmen up on the walls as we make our way back to what will inevitably be the final stand here in this plaza that overlooks CARAS SANT's docks. We have some Helvellyn Hammer Guard. Good to see them. Armour piercing, after all, will certainly not go amiss. I mean, Rhun, especially with some of the higher tier units we're seeing here, and of course the Rhovanion units from Rhovanion, both of which will not like facing off against those Warhammers. We have Morroquendi pikes, we have Helvellyn marksmen, we have Nandor Glade Guard as well, another unit of Helvellyn Hammer Guard as well from Adin Men, and a third from Tundra's Fox, so all of these units very much back here, and Morroquendi pikes as well. So, we also have another unit of Nandor Glade Guard in here in this little frontal courtyard with the tree in the centre. Going to be interesting this. I mean, there's plenty of ways the defenders could decide to set themselves up, and that I think is going to be the interesting thing initially. But we shall see. We'll make a little cut and we'll rejoin when the first ranks are clashing. So I guess we will actually just rejoin right away here rather than wait for a little cut, because it does look as though we are going to see some sort of sally out. It's pretty rare, I would suggest, that we see a sort of mass infantry sally out, especially in this kind of situation where, I mean, Dorwinion don't exactly have the numbers to be able to overwhelm Rhun right from the start, and of course this does put their infantry directly in the way of the Dragon's Breath artillery over there, so I'm a little bit confused as to what Alexios and Eclipse have planned here. Bit of a risk, but it could yet pay off. They're also counter-attacking into the side of the field where the attackers are, in theory at the very least, at their very strongest, with two armies over here. We've already mentioned the artillery, of course, and then there's the small matter of the chariots as well, which I questioned how useful they were necessarily going to be in this kind of situation, given the more confined nature of the streets in a siege battle like this, but that of course ceases to be an issue when you're fighting on more open fields. It does give a little bit more time perhaps for the walls to be used more effectively, and archers and the like can be used better, and I suppose, given the lack of foot archers that we have seen on display from the attackers, that does make a certain amount of sense, but we'll have to wait and see on that one. A little bit of shuffling around so far from the attackers, but perhaps they are also reconsidering what they were going to do given the new reality of what they see before them. Now, there aren't any pebbles over here, but I assume there is a river crossing to be used. Otherwise it would be very peculiar as to why Mavin is over here in the first place, and the fact that there are two very obvious walls to be used as well. No gate over here, interestingly enough, though. Going to have to use siege towers and artillery perhaps to poke walls in over here. Only the other two approaches are furnished with actual gates, and still setting themselves out here. Several units, but I mean, the combination of Helvellyn infantry and Morroquendi pikes should be a fairly strong one against most of what Rhun has to offer. Rhovanion are actually going to be a little bit more able to face off directly against that sort of thing. Nandor Glade Guard as well, but again out in the open. Small matter of those Glade Lords as well. I mean, it makes a certain amount of sense that the Glade Lords would come out here. They can either be saved right till the very end, which is risky, or they can be used right from the start, which exposes them to the most amount of peril, especially when it comes to a force like the Rhovanion here. Plenty of anti-cavalry at their disposal. Heavy spears from the Hoplons, and then of course there's also the Phalanx. Rhovanion nobles being held in reserve a little bit more, perhaps. I would suggest the Glade Lords would have the beating of the Rhovanion cavalry in sustained melee. The Rhovanions have a bit more of a focus around charging into infantry and doing damage that way, whereas of course heavier Elven cavalry is always going to be a little bit more well-rounded when it comes to their abilities in melee. Again, Morroquendi pikes out in front. It's a bold initial setup, not what I was expecting. Does of course make a retreat a little bit more difficult because they bottleneck themselves with their own gate, but again, we shall simply have to wait and see what's going on here. The horns from familiar from Dale. Moroquendi bows also waiting, but so far still rather quiet. I think it's pretty much a given that it's going to be this side of the battlefield where things are going to kick off first. Gamp Rim and Flag Rim. Combination really of a more armour piercing yet shorter range and less defensible front line of Rhun, and then you have the spear and pike combination that Rhovanion can bring to bear. Less able to deal damage perhaps, but maybe a little bit more reliable when going toe to toe with some of the stronger units that Dorwinion has to offer, and backing themselves up against the wall as well. Again, putting themselves in full view of that Dragon's Breath is bold, to say the least. We'll go up to ×2 speed as well here, just to get a little shift on, because it's really going to be a case of things getting underway fairly quickly. I mean, I suppose when they're backed up this far, the chariots aren't really going to be able to do their thing. They can still cause a good amount of chaos, but with how dense the defensive line actually is, you would suggest that they may find themselves dying off a little bit more quickly. Mass pushing units like that, or high mass units like that, can often be a little bit of a scary prospect once they get rolling. Carmel's Immortals around the side. Is there a way across the river here? Yes, there is. Can they actually get up over here? I think it's intentional based on the fact that the terrain has clearly been sculpted with that in mind. One unit of infantry make their way up here. I mean, one unit of Carmel's Immortals, as much as they can put up a decent fight in melee for a while, they're not really going to make any progress. It will just be the token effort of trying to hit the defenders from as many angles as possible. It's clearly a joint effort though. This isn't just one player doing this, it's both Eclipse and Alexios who have elected to take this stance. Still just moving themselves around a little. Tribal Berserkers giving that extra aggressive edge that will be so useful against the rank and file of Dorwinion. Again, perhaps this initial decision to go outside is really going to colour the perceptions of the rest of the battle, I think. Starting to see the attackers close in, and indeed they can make their way across. And yes, indeed, the archers do open up. I mean, they may as well. It's not the best of shots, of course. The siege towers themselves capable of absorbing a fair amount of that pressure. Off the wall. I mean, Nandor Glade Guard, they're not going to be able to get a charge off on the walls, and it's a fair amount of defence that they're going to have to mulch their way through. If they want to defeat the Scion Rim, they're going to need a little bit of support in order to do that, I think, but they do have the direct support of stuff like Moroquendi Bow, so they should be okay as long as they're willing to commit a fair amount of numbers to this. I mean, Mevin doesn't have artillery over on this side, so he doesn't have the option of poking holes in the wall, so he's going to have to use the siege towers. And I would suggest crumbling the walls would probably be a little bit more user-friendly for Rhun, but siege towers should do okay. Let's have a look. Sin still not too eager on moving forward right from the off. We can see very quickly actually things started to kick off over here, which is a little bit breakneck perhaps, but the Flag Rim being backed up by the more defensive Rhovakin Hoplons. Interesting to see as well, the Gamp Rim are the Phalanx unit that they're sending forward right from the start here. They don't have the range to be able to compete directly really with the Moroquendi Pikes. There's also a small matter of this Elvalin Marksman firing line, which is able to fire away. I think they are trying to go after the Rhovakin Phalanx, but of course this is where those shields are going to come into effect. Under normal circumstances this would be a bit of a rough situation for a unit of pikes like this, but those shields will help equalise that fight, and getting onto the front line will also help the infantry force deal with the pressure of having to attack into those Moroquendi Pikes as well. I mean, Nandor Glade Riders and Glade Lords are kind of stuck in behind their own infantry at this point. They don't have a way of escaping. They can't go through the enemy ranks either because it's blanketed with spears, halberds and pikes. They would get absolutely eviscerated if they even tried. A lot of these hoplons are shaken though. The pressure of this frontline engagement and the hoplons running as well. The Easterlings themselves are shaken. The close proximity of that cavalry, the missile damage overhead, and the elven damage they're facing in melee. Even these upper mid-tier units really thinking about fleeing in the face of such hardship. And they are going to try and escape through this slightly more buckled section of the line, and they will escape into the open field. And just as the support was coming forward from the Rhovanion as well to try and help deal with that Dorwinion defensive line, the Dorwinion cavalry is going to at the very least get in the way and delay that support from being useful. The Gamprim also fleeing from this front line now in a bit of a rear charge. The Rhovirum nobles having to be used in a more defensive capacity to try and contain these Glade Lords now. More javelins moving forward. So there's a lot to consider here already. It has turned into a pretty chaotic affair, but one that actually Dorwinion probably will be pretty happy with at the moment, and they'll be absolutely ecstatic if they can cause mass routing among the ranks of all of these units over here, and they're well on their way to doing that if they can continue to rear charge. They're actually getting a fair amount of friendly fire as well. The archers trying to kill off those Glade Lords, but any missed shots are hitting their own men, and their fire arrows as well, so rubbing salt into the mental wounds already. The tribal berserkers, definitely a welcome sight, I'm sure, for the attackers on the front line now. It'll definitely pile the pressure onto a unit like the Elvelyn, and with more and more pressure, in all fairness, we are starting to see the balance of power shift a little bit in melee. The initial damage being done may start to give way to some sustained attacking pressure. The phalanx and, again, that support coming in from the ranged units. Key, Rhovikin nobles also on their way in. Similar shaped shields, of course, to Dorwinion, geographically very close to one another. Meanwhile, Sin has reached the walls with siege towers and rams. The Carmels and Mortals as well, but for now, Mavin also making the attempt to put some pressure on this side of things, a more traditional opening to a siege battle over here, with the attempt to try and take the walls. It is interesting that the more defensive unit of the Scion Rim are moving forward. But of course, like I said, the Nandor Glade Guard do have a fair amount of swinging to do before they can make their way through the hefty defensive values that the Scion Rim offer. The Scion Rim are also less likely to rout than we've seen some of the runic units perhaps fighting at the base of the wall on the other side have been doing, and they should do fine against the Elvelyn. It's more a case of these archers in close proximity represent a bit of a problem, and of course the Scion Rim's mental fortitude will be tested with those poison projectiles coming in, as well as the regular ones actually, from the Elvelyn marksmen. So it is a bit of a killing field that's been set up, but like I said, Mavin doesn't really have any choice but to advance into this situation, pile the pressure on and hope that either Dorwinion undercommit to the front line or they buckle in other places and he's pinned them in place long enough for a surrounding action to take place. Fighting at the base of the wall still over here. You can see that the Chariot's missile contingent trying to be used to its fullest, which is a bit of a rarity in all fairness. If you see the Chariots used on the open field where they're a little bit more at home, you will see them used aggressively more quickly than we have done here, but of course it would be suicidal to do that when there are still so many pikes active. And the pikes are still reasonably healthy as well, as much as we are starting to see the Dorwinion lines tested a little bit more roundly. They are at the very least still hanging on. Tribal Levy Slingers getting charged, but again, 120 Glade Lords are routing, and that's not terribly surprising. We saw them get away with this earlier on, where the attacking line was a little bit weaker, but trying to get through here. There are Gamprim and Hoplons nearby, and even stuff like the Tribal Berserkers are going to do huge amounts of damage to cavalry per swing, as most shock infantry of that type can. When the charge of the cavalry doesn't connect with them directly, they can be a real menace to riders as well. Meanwhile, Rhovikin nobles finding their way in behind the line, and we're going to start to see, I think, this Dorwinion front line collapse. Despite some initial promise, we are seeing now why this sort of thing can be a little bit more risky. There's going to be no retreat either, because with the Rhovikin nobles at the forefront of things as well, they are going to be able to completely cut off the gatehouse. The Rhovikin phalanx also helping to consolidate any gains that may be made. Yeah, the combination here of the phalanx, the armor piercing and melee from Rhun, the range support in particular I think from the Rhovanion, it's a little bit difficult to again gauge the impact of that sort of thing, especially when it comes to the slingers, because their projectiles are so difficult to keep track of. But yeah, Dorwinion struggling to maintain their position at the foot of the wall as Sin makes his way into the settlement as well, a unit of Scion Rim. Going to be sandwiched now by the force of Tundra's Fox. A single unit of Scion Rim, of course, isn't going to achieve too much, but it does at least force an engagement of Dorwinion. I mean, they are pretty densely packed on these walls over here. Tundra definitely wanting to contest the walls, as has been the case, to be fair, on this side as well. Seeing the Nandor Glade Guard, it was initially Carmel's Immortals, but it looks like they retreated back down the ladder and now they're having to go after Carmel's Chosen instead. I mean, Carmel's Chosen, of course, the highest level of runic infantry, and they will be able to overcome Nandor Glade Guard. Be interesting to see if Added Men notices the calibre of unit that has been sent up here, and with a little bit of support from the Carmel's Immortals as well. Numbers will be in their favour as well, and they should be able to start pushing their way through. Meanwhile, over here, they're still maintaining their position on the walls. The Elvelyn infantry is routing. The addition of the Carmel's Shadow Guard up here adding some much needed armour piercing along with some flag rim actually. So they are going to be able to push down off the walls now, but it has been a costly affair for Mevin, unsurprisingly given the elven arrow fire that he has found himself under. Glade Guard still fighting hard up on the walls, but you can see pike blocks already in the way and infantry all ready to go to support them also. Victory seems certain, only a fool could lose this battle. I don't know, I think Added Man has got things pretty under control over here for now, as can be said, well I was going to say as can be said over here, but Sin has really ratcheted up the pressure now. Scion Rim, the initial unit being sent in, but now plenty of Gamp Rim, Carmel's Shadow Guard, lots of units also contesting the walls, but it's going to be a bit of a difficult slog up here. Flag Rim, it's not really an ideal matchup for them with the Nandor Glade Guard, but just getting infantry up here that are going to be reasonably able to keep themselves alive and contest the walls is important. Try and really gain that momentum. If they can do that, if they can gain momentum either over here or on Mevin's side, Rhun will be pretty damn pleased. Or the attackers, I should say, will be pretty damn pleased with how the battle should develop from there. And Tundra doesn't really have a great deal of choice other than to double down on this fight at the moment. He can't retreat because too much has already been committed, really. And we're now also seeing the walls start to be contested as well, not wanting to let up with any of their momentum. Carmel's Chosen and Flag Rim, I mean, these Elvelyn marksmen being caught cold, and it should be no surprise whatsoever that these units are going to get absolutely monstered by the best that Rhun has to offer in such ways. Dragon's Breath Cannon trying to destroy a section of the wall with archers still on it. Again, just crumbling a section of the wall will be useful for reasons I've already mentioned. They are going to have to push up their rams though, so there will be a little bit of a delay between their victory at the base of the wall essentially and then their ability to truly start pouring into the settlement. But with the amount that was lost out there, you'd have to assume that Eclipse and Alexios are not going to be able to put up the same level of comprehensive defence that Tundra and Added Men are going to be able to do in the north and in the east. Meanwhile, this initial assault from this one unit of Scion Rim, they are starting to fall away, but again we're seeing Carmel's Chosen used aggressively, sprinkling in that little bit of quality which is going to make life a little bit more difficult for them. I don't think the Dragon's Breath has actually been used in terms of its damage. I mean, the crew itself is obviously very, very strong as well, being used in the same way that we've seen rams and siege towers used in the past, trying to bisect the Dorwinion defence, kind of something that's always been present in Medieval 2. And it does work. It's maybe a little bit overrated in terms of what it can actually accomplish, this sort of thing, especially if you don't have the numbers to be able to follow through with it, but it does actually serve a function. Rhovan infantry struggling a little bit. We've got the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen. Don't think we've seen their projectiles as of yet either, but their melee abilities are why they're being called upon here. Far more skill in the bank than the Helvelan infantry. And they are securing vast swathes of the wall now. Eastron crossbowmen having to bank their shots a little bit, but again, maximum efficiency is something which is demanded of more of defenders, generally speaking. So as long as you're getting some decent hits as the attackers, we're probably onto a winner there. And as we've already mentioned, I mean, more reinforcements have arrived. The Carmel's Immortals pushing their way forwards, prevent any reinforcements getting onto the walls. So it's not going to go completely unnoticed, this little assault. The Carmel's Chosen up here, and Glade God. I mean, the Carmel's Chosen have actually taken some damage as well. It is, after all, a more damaging unit of Elven infantry they've had to face off against. Oof. You can see here as well, Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen, they are using their projectiles over here. It's a good thing the Helvelan infantry are here. If the pikes were still completely exposed by themselves, this would be a little bit devastating. These Morroquendi pikes, after all, forming up the spine of the Dorwinion defence over on this side of the map now. A little bit more constricting on this side of the map, you'd have to say as well, for Mevon. Not only is there no gates and he's had to use the siege towers, but the pathways are a little bit more narrow over here. The terrain is also against him, so it's a side of the settlement which possibly has a higher degree of difficulty than the one that the defenders attempted to defend the base of the wall on the other side. A little bit more flat over here, perhaps. The streets are a little wider. It looks like an awful lot of dead Dorwinion troops at the base of that wall. Don't know how much of an excuse there is for not noticing that. I mean, if they're out of ammunition, like, it's not the biggest loss in the world, those Helvelan marksmen, but every little helps in this kind of situation. Gamprim on the walls with Shadow Guard, again, surrounding Helvelan marksmen. It's probably at this point in time, given the lower amount of units that Alexios and Eclipse can afford to commit to this side now, that the defenders should probably be looking at wholesale retreats now. Be proactive rather than reactive, as they say. So only 60 of them remain up on the walls. It's not as if they have nothing, of course, but Dragon's Wrath crossbowmen scything their way through some of these Nandor Glade Guard, and we're starting to see units climb down from the walls as well before the gates have even fallen. Scion Rim getting in here. Carmel's Chosen taking the initiative as well, albeit this is going to be a little bit of a difficult one for them to mulch their way through all on their own. They may be strong, but there are only 50 of them, and indeed they end up paying for it with the loss of the general. Well, his general does fall, and Rhun's morale, as we saw actually in the very early stages outside the walls, Easterling morale is most assuredly not infallible. River Patrol as well, but yeah, I mean, looking over here as well, Rhun have clearly moved forward. I don't know how much of this is a little bit intentional from Dorwinion. How have they managed to retreat anything, or is everything that was committed over there just dead to the last man? They're still contesting the walls, but it's a little bit harder to do an orderly retreat from a wall like this. Defeat a distinct possibility. What remains of the Helvelan infantry sandwiched between, or being battered through by armour-piercing infantry such as they are. 20 bows on their way down. Crossbows making their way in as well. I mean, a devastating unit. We've only seen a little bit of them so far. River Patrol against Balkoth Tribesmen. 2 units far more well renowned for their ranged abilities rather than their very limited melee ones, but I don't know if the River Patrol have used up all their ammunition. You'd assume so if they're being used as a blocking unit to save something like Morroquendi bows, which are a little bit more impressive in melee and at range. But we are starting to see, I think, a little bit more of a wholesale retreat from Tundra. Are we going to see the same from the Dorwinion forces over here? The walls being blanketed in fire, Nandor Glade Guard fighting hard. I mean, in all fairness, this unit of Carmel's Chosen is pretty out on a limb here. I think they are going to survive, but that's more as a result of the units having to retreat. In the long run, it would be the the unwise move to try and stay and kill a unit of bodyguard infantry which is already fairly damaged. Defeat seems certain. The Rhovanion Hoplons, that's a little bit surprising. And or Gladeguard, there aren't enough of them surely to mulch their way through all of those heavy spears. Now we've got that transitional phase in a battle which often favours attackers. It doesn't have to be as painful for the defenders as it often is, I find, but very often they leave the retreat just a little bit too late, and that allows the attackers to catch them while retreating. What have we over here? Elvalin Marksmen trying to salvage this section of the formation over here. Morroquendi Bows fighting hard, but the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen are right up in there, and that's going to be a concern. The damage, they're going to be really difficult to get rid of as well with the defensive values the dual wielders and assassin class units in general have, especially for a unit of Elvalin Marksmen, but the call has been made. There's still units defending the walls over here as well, which is impressive, but they will be dealt with now. There is still that, it's just rams over there, of course. Useless from a runic perspective over here, but I don't know how much of them they're going to really be able to retreat. I mean, none, I think, at this point. Mevan's units are going to be able to surround what remains of Dorwinion over here. There is the alternate path they can take as well, down through the docks, and that can take them right around. This is probably going to be one of those sections of the city that we don't really see in action if ever we see this map in the future, purely because it's really just a route to take, I think, to retreat, more so than to defend. Interesting to see if Mevan does take that route today, and I'm proved wrong. Reviran nobles loitering with intent over there, so they are going to form up a little bit of a defence in this square over here. It's not the first time we've seen defensive positions for archers like this. The elven walkways and the more generic elven settlements that we've seen offer this kind of thing as well, and the Elvalin Marksmen have got very clear shots as a result. Going after something like the tribal berserkers would definitely be the play here. Far more vulnerable than the armoured and shielded Rhovanion, and also arguably more dangerous. So their chances at winning, given the amount of damage they are capable of, unsurprisingly there's one unit of River Patrol being used as a rear guard, do decide to flee now. The combined weight of the Easterlings and the tribesmen of the Rhovanion crashing down upon them. Morroquendi Bows here as well. There's a lot of angles to cover though. That's the only downside, I think, to this little section. The archers will be very pleased with the defensive position they've decided to take up, much as they would have been when they decided to put their infantry at the base of the wall as well. It gives the archers a better shot, but it may very well come at the expense of more of the lives of the infantrymen being tasked to try and hold the line. Victory seems certain thus far. The tribal berserkers have taken a bit of a beating on the approach. Of course, when they're directly under, that will be when it becomes a little bit more difficult to justify the archers' positioning. Dragon's Breath Cannon there managing to bisect the Morroquendi Bows and the Elvalin infantry over on this side, though there is a little bit more of a lull before that side of the square will be placed under pressure. Rhun only just now cleaning up what remains of the Dorwinion lines over on this side, and then attacking from the front also. Not perfectly in sync here, but I do think momentum, maintaining that momentum for the attackers is important. Not many of these Morroquendi Bows remaining, going after those Balkoth tribesmen, but again, they're going to be able to do damage to them, but Balkoth tribesmen, fairly unopposed, are going to be able to fire their missiles in, place Dorwinion under just that little bit more pressure. Tribal Levy Slingers in melee, unsurprisingly already shaken. I mean, this isn't really what they're going to be best at, especially when you consider there's Elvalin Hammerguard right there. This is a little bit above their pay grade, but again, Elvalin Hammerguard being committed fairly early, for defenders' standards anyway. We've already seen pretty much all the Carmels chosen actually, and the Rhovanion nobles, so the attackers have not been shy about using their high quality units, which is good to see. And now the defenders are going to have to reciprocate that. Plenty of base damage as well as being arm piercing, of course, those hammer guards, so they will crush the skulls really of those tribal units, the basic ones. Again, the poison projectiles, we haven't really seen any mass routing as a result of the poison projectiles thus far. Perhaps at later points in the battle we will. So they're already future-proofing by the looks of things, Dorwinion, by retreating yet further, maintaining their position in this square for a shorter amount of time, most certainly. Are Rhun going to be blocking? And well, there is another route up here, so yeah, perhaps they will be attacking from the rear end of the settlement after all. Flag Rim. Marching their way uphill, Gamprin as well, Wain Riders of Rhun, only 6 of them remain. Where are all the corpses of those chariots then? Where were they used? Ah. Yeah, they're all there. So there was a blob of infantry there that the chariots probably got caught on. I mean, with Dorwinion already retreating, you would assume now that, I mean, there's still a decent amount of units on this line. You can tell just based on the fact that the frame rate is struggling just a little bit. But trying to retreat yet more of the units, Helvellyn infantry. Are they going to get away from here without routing completely? They're wavering. Yeah, trying to peel a few more units off. Rhovanion nobles being used aggressively once again to wrap around lines. Difficult units get rid of with their defensive stats. Scion Rim damaged, but a key building block of their efforts so far. Carmel's shadow bows now claiming this position. Of course, it's not. Well, they do actually have a pretty decent shot into those Dorwinion units over there. Based on the slight terrain increase, they should be able to actually get some decent direct hits. Rangers, of course, not body piercing any longer, just much higher base damage, but a lot of the Dorwinion shielded units will be hoping they can mitigate a lot of that damage, but it's probably still worth trying to whittle down the health of this front line with the Rangers. You're scarcely going to get a better chance after all. The terrain only gets more extreme in the defenders' favour further up the hill. Morquendi Pikes, though, easily able to keep this initial foray by the Easterlings over on this side at arm's length. Some more tribals on the way forward. There's still cavalry. I don't know. I feel like if the Rhovanion nobles are going to be useful for the attacks at this point, it will be as a killing blow more than anything else. You can try and use them as part of a mass push, I suppose. Cavalry can do that. The AI is very well known for doing that in Medieval 2 campaigns, I've found, but there's a large blob of Easterlings. More javelin men. Very depleted unit of Morquendi bows, but again, the more arrows that can find their way into attacker bodies, the better it's going to be in the long run for the defenders. And that's really the key here. Like I've often said in these kind of replays, it's very difficult to keep track of all of the archers and how well they're actually doing. Very often the only way you can really find that out from a defending perspective is the attackers, for some reason, start to run out of steam, even though from a tactical perspective, from the way they've been moving their infantry and when they've been pushing, they seem to have been doing quite well. If they end up running out of steam anyway, it's often a sign that the defenders' skirmishing game has been on point. And the attackers also trying to do the same. Shadow bows firing in. And they are going to start to consolidate here around the top of the settlement. I mean, there is technically another walkway that can be used here. The Dorwinion Palace. The VINTER-LORD. His fine abode. Still, lots of lag as this very significant force starts to move forward. I am interested actually. I mean, obviously my new PC is going to be far less susceptible to that than the old one, but obviously we are getting into summer and my apartment is very, very warm in the summer, so I'm going to have to sort of set up, I think, some extra cooling measures for my PC as we march ever further into June and July. Tribal Levy skirmishers. Flaming shots being fired from lower down in the settlement. Victory seems certain. Only a fool could lose this battle. I mean, having a look at the percentages, the defenders are down by 3%, but that is, you can make that up in the late game if you have the quality to do so, and if you have the range support to do so as well. And to be fair, the attackers have been committing a fair amount of their own quality fairly readily, so it's not as if they can go directly blow for blow with that kind of pressure if it comes down to it. They're still going to have to rely on momentum and overwhelming the enemy to a certain extent. Rhovanion nobles here in the vanguard, but the presence of Morroquendi pikes is going to help take the edge off this pretty high quality attack, actually, when you consider it's also Dragon's Wrath crossbowmen that are alongside these nobles. Cavalry as well, a little bit of a lag on the rest of the units making their way up the hill as well, so that is worth bearing in mind as well. A little bit of a messy front line over here, though, you'd have to say. Elvalin Vanguard forming up a defensive line with River Patrol in behind, but Rhun spilling around the ranks of those spears, and then also spilling around the River Patrol to get to the Morroquendi bows in behind. I mean, you could say Rhun have potentially overextended themselves here, but I think the aggression is right, because it's helping to shut down any potential missile support that Dorwinion would still like to lay on for their unit of spears, which are still fighting here at the base. I mean, they're wavering, except victory is almost a certainty damage. I was going to say that doesn't seem right at all, but now normality restored, defeat almost a certainty, surrounded by assassin class units and halberds as they are. Reinforcements now being sent up to those high-end units. Same is also true of Dorwinion, though, clogging the way with what numbers they have left. I mean, you can hear the crunching sound that the Dragon's Breath cannon is causing, although based on the angles they have, I think it's more of a psychological tool than anything else at this point. I mean, it's going to be very difficult, I think, to thread the needle and get an absolutely devastating hit with your artillery as Rhun at this point, but it does restrict what Dorwinion are able to do as well. It's not as if they start to gain momentum, Dorwinion counter-attacking would be a foolish move based on the runic artillery still on the field. They're going to have to play things a little bit more carefully than that. Morroquendi pikes, Elvalin marksmen on the front line. The marksmen, like I said, it's just a unit that packs on the armour. They aren't the worst thing in the world, but a little bit of extra quality probably going to be necessary in melee. I mean, there's 2 units of guildsmen down here with the more defensive Scion Rim as well, and it's not as if the Morroquendi pikes are in the best of formations here, a little bit stretched, a little bit parallel to the path rather than blocking it off in a more distinct defensive manner, although I guess that does limit the potential for that artillery to be devastating, but I would still say that they are going to be worryingly able to score a good hit here. You can see the Dragon's Breath trying to trundle its way into position. I mean, artillery can be a bit of a pig in this kind of situation, but it's not the be-all and end-all for the attackers, which is their saving grace, the Hammer Guard. Still 72 of them remaining, and I mean, 1-to-1, the armour piercing gives them a distinct edge over something like the Rhovanion nobles, and even the Dragon's Wrath crossbowmen to a certain extent, and pike to pike as well, the Morroquendi pikes and the Rhovanion phalanx. We've already mentioned in the composition phase how they would interact with one another. From a pure melee standpoint, the extra damage from the Elven pikes should see them through. Honestly, that warhorn there sounded almost like a fly in my ear, or like a wasp or something. Most unsettling. But here we are, another unit of Elvalin Hammer Guard being committed forward over here, and over on this side of things as well is a little bit less in terms of quality. I mean, Carmel's Chosen will be coming down here, but they're already significantly weakened from their exertions on the outer defences. So, yeah, in terms of individual quality of units, I think the Elvalin Hammer Guard give Dorwinion a fairly nice edge for them to have, that armor piercing as well. May not be the absolute necessity against Rhun that it is against the likes of Gondor or the dwarves, but it's still going to be useful against these golden boys over here. And we did mention the composition phase as well. Rhun have gone fairly quality centric. It's not as if they have a limitless supply of numbers. In terms of high numbers units, it's the tribal contingent from Rhovanion really that they still have a few of. Could it be that they run out of steam in terms of numbers here? It is a 4v4 after all. It's not a 5v3, which you can afford to be a little bit more gung-ho as attackers at that point. It's really incumbent on the defenders to set the table out perfectly. Whereas in a 4v4, the attackers have to be a little bit more methodical about things when they choose to commit, when they choose to ease off a little bit. Once again, they're trying to use their artillery as this. I think Froggy probably saw that he wasn't going to be able to use his artillery in the direct manner that maybe he would have wanted. I don't know how much ammunition he has left either, considering quite a lot of it went into breaking down that one section of wall. The crew itself, of course, being very strong melee combatants, is perhaps going to be a little bit necessary on this front line to try and break at least one of these Dorwinion positions, because if one of these Dorwinion front lines falls, of course, the others are exposed. And there we have all Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen climbing up onto the walls, and they can go right across the walkways then to get over here. That's also a way they can actually circumvent the defences entirely and try to go after the town centre directly. There's only 23 of them remaining, but I mean, they should still be able to get through those Elvelyn marks. It'll be slow because of how narrow the line is, and then there is also the small matter of those archers probably tipping the balance back into the defenders' favour there, but that is something. You can go up that little doorway there where the cursor is and completely go round this defence, or at least try to. Dorwinion did have units in reserve, however. But yeah, like I said, if one of these defensive positions falls, of course, you can then introduce the domino effect as the attackers, as we have seen so often in valiant defensive performances in the past. That can be a real killer, but if Dorwinion can maintain these three and a bit, considering that little foray from the guildsmen positions, they should be fine. And the fact that they have managed to maintain a decent amount of pikes is very, very handy. Rhovanion phalanx still fighting hard, but they're on the wrong side of this curved engagement now, as Dorwinion start to crush forwards, and the damage of the hammer guard, the numbers of stuff like the marksmen, and then the anchor of the pikes is a very, very nasty combination indeed. It's over here, I think, where the attackers probably have the best chance, because the quality of the Dorwinion forces on this front line seems to be a little bit lower, and with stuff like Guildsmen, with the Dragon's Breath crew, and the fact that Froggy still has some units that can be committed, including Sapphire Blazeman, very dangerous, Dragon's Wrath Crossbowman, trying to get some good shots in. Combining all of those factors together, Dorwinion probably do have something to worry about over here. Bows, a couple of units of bows, and they do still have some reinforcements that can be committed, but you'll see poison projectiles going after those Sapphire Bladesmen. You can see there that the Hammer Guard having none of that. They don't want to be allowing the Sapphire Bladesmen to utilise their not insubstantial levels of range damage. I mean, they're pretty damn good in melee as well. They're one of the units actually that should be able to stand up to the Hammer Guard, but with a little bit of range support, their slightly lower armour values in general may very well prove to be their undoing. And down here on the lower levels as well, the pikes, Cummel's Chosen coming forward once again. They're not completely out of steam yet, but they are starting to run the well a little dry here, the attackers. And if that happens, Dorwinion then have quite a few units freed up that they can then use to defend other positions. It's over here where Dorwinion, I think, are at their most stable actually. Victory will take perhaps a little longer, considering the higher numbers tribal units that are in behind them, but the combination of pikes and hammer guard over here is pretty good, so I do think the attackers are going to have to get a bit of a shift on, otherwise even though for the moment the opportunity still exists over on this choke point. That opportunity will vanish pretty quickly if all of a sudden the entire contingent of the Dorwinion defenders can focus on just the one choke. Guildsman. Both huge bombards just in the way. Narrowing the choke point as well, so maybe getting in the way more of the attackers here, although I think the numbers are even enough to the point where it doesn't really make too much of a difference either way. Crossbows, Eastron crossbows. And a Glade Guard on the way forwards. Sapphire Bladesman. Still up here, and now unopposed, interestingly enough. That's the sort of thing which the attackers will be wanting to see a bit more of. Elval and Hammerguard leaving this position on the front line. Marksmen and Pikes being sent over to block Froggy's continued advancement. What's this? More Nandor Glade Guard by the looks of things. 60 of them moving forward, trying to add a little bit of attacking spice to finally break the back of this attack over here. Still the Dragon's Breath. I mean, still manning the artillery piece as well. Surely they still have ammunition, but I mean, as soon as the lines are cleared and they have a clear shot, it's, yeah, I mean, they're not going to be able to load the artillery quickly enough, and unsurprisingly Dorwinion are making a beeline to try and make sure they don't, because one fortunate shot from that and all of a sudden the situation looks very, very different. Over yonder, yeah, slowly but surely, as Elval and Hammerguard have really been very, very useful for this final tier defence. One of those situations where holding on to a bit of elite quality in the long run has truly helped the defenders. Solid defensive stats with the armour and the shields, and then obviously the armour-piercing bite from the hammers as well. When you combine it with the Morroquendi pikes as well, perhaps the slight deficit they have from their melee defense as a result of the kind of unit that they are is also not quite so apparent. And Rhun, in all fairness, are not really the faction best placed to be dealing with that kind of deficit anyway, when you consider equivalent units. But strong crossbows in position. I mean, that's a fairly substantial unit of crossbows. I don't know whether they're going to have the best of angles though. Like I said, time is slowly but surely running out. Hammerguard. Free unit of Hammerguard. I mean, Banco Sapphire Bladesman in here, but a fairly full unit of Nandor Glade Guard blocking their continued progress, and Sapphire Bladesman looking a little bit bloodied at this stage. Morroquendi bows back in the town centre. Dorwinion consolidating around the town centre at this point. I don't know if that's even necessary, in all fairness. Rhovanion nobles loitering with intent. I mean, those are valid marksmen. Maybe the Rhovanion will be able to get through here after all. I think guarding the choke points probably would have been wiser if they allow those Rhovanion nobles to get in and amongst this unit up here. I mean, this is a fairly wide open area. A few charges from the cavalry. Maybe Dorwinion are the ones likely to run out of steam here. Looking at this, they are still behind by 4%, in spite of the fact that positionally they probably have done really well here. In terms of the percentage gap, it hasn't actually changed from last we saw it. It may very well have fluctuated further away from Dorwinion, and now it's been brought back into a little bit more parity. But I mean, this is a problem. Retreating from the choke points and allowing the Dragon's Wrath crossbows up onto this walkway overhead with no answer is a little bit of a problem. The level of stopping power that a unit of crossbows like that have. And the Rhovanion nobles, Morroquendi pikes, just about missing them, in all fairness. And they're going to try and shoot them, but they may kill off the odd rider or two, but this charge is going to connect, and that's going to Well, actually, the lances did not come down. The swords remained out, so that was not a devastating charge. And of course, the Morroquendi bows do have anti-cavalry in melee. Could be worse for Dorwinion, but it's certainly not ideal to see cavalry running roughshod all over you. Dragon's Wrath crossbows trying to continue firing on guard mode then, which is going to allow those hammer guard to crunch through them a little bit more. It's going to have to be through quality that Dorwinion still win this. The hammer guard, can they see Dorwinion over the line? It's turned into a pretty chaotic affair. Ooh, dear. Well, they finally found a use for it, and that is going to be fairly key, I think. I mean, they needed to respond to the Dragon's Wrath crossbows. They couldn't do nothing but Sin with the perfect response to that. Doing an awful lot of damage there to the Hammer Guard. Trying to consolidate with the other unit of Elvalan Hammer Guard now and maybe kill off this unit of Dragon's Wrath crossbowmen under the walkway. Less of an obvious target for those Dragon's Breath crewmen, but like I said, those artillery crewmen are effectively bodyguard units in and of themselves, and there's still 54 of them remaining. So this may go down as a valiant loss. We're talking about how the attackers could end up running out of stamina, as it were. But I think it's going to be the defenders instead. Morroquendi bows still trying to deal with this cavalry which has been allowed in, and that's a real concern. Even if the cavalry itself hasn't got tons of damage off charging, it's been a nuisance back here, and it's been preventing more of the Vinelanders' support from doing what it should be doing. Finally, that unit of Dragon's Wrath crossbows has been dealt with. I think that might be the first Dorwinion general that's fallen. Whatever that was a miss. Elvalan Hammerguard moving down here, but again, Dragon's Breath and Dragon's Wrath crossbowmen, with their powers combined, will be able to overcome a battered and bruised unit of Hammerguard. Maybe with the other unit, but even then, it's going to be tough. I mean, those are not pushover units. If it was standard artillery crewmen and just a unit of basic infantry, then yes, but given the situation, most assuredly not. 63 Dragon's Breath crew as well. Sapphire Bladesmen, 123 Sapphire Bladesmen. So yeah, I think this is going to end in favour of the attackers. I think certainly the outer defence, it's been a fairly back and forth affair. Like the initial outer defence looked pretty good for the defenders, then pretty quickly it shifted into favour of the attackers, making their way through the settlement. Unsurprisingly, the attackers gaining a bit of a foothold, and then here in the final stand, Dorwinion doing quite well, I would say. But not quite well enough to overturn the advantage that the attackers had built up earlier. Rhovirim nobles, I should say, Rhovikin, but Rhovirim nobles now pretty thin on the ground, but they've done their job. The cavalry has been useful after all, not in terms of outright kills, but certainly in terms of what they've actually brought to the table in real terms. Strong crossbows wavering. Still Elven units are up against after all. Even with the situation they find themselves in, they still aren't sure if they are going to remain. Marksman.
Our men have slain the enemy general. Without him, his troops will lose their will to fight.
What's this? Dragon's Breath. Yeah, we're starting to see now the rather swift destruction of the Dorwinion leadership corps. Seven Hammer Guardsmen. Morroquendi bows. Sapphire Bladesmen. Taking the odd odd hit here and there from those Morroquendi bows.
Our enemy has command of the city.
There's really nothing else now. Yeah, Sapphire Bladesman. I think there's only one Dorwinion general left with the loss of that one.
The enemy is no longer in command of the city.
Just trying to think, trying to find what's left at this stage. 3 Hammer Guard down here, being cleaned up by those Dragon's Wrath crossbows. Cavalry still alive. All these Morroquendi bows over here getting pelted by stones by the looks of things. So still those tribal levy slingers. Yeah, and ultimately I do think it's actually been a pretty good battle, this one actually. There's nothing really that I would say either side did horrendously wrong. I mean, I suppose you could argue the slightly unorthodox nature of the sally out defence at the beginning, but you couldn't really say it was a complete failure in that regard. Initially things were looking pretty good over there, but I mean, I guess the argument can be made that it turned in the attacker's favour maybe a little bit too quickly, but even so, I think both sides have done a pretty bang-up job here. Having a look, yeah, 4% the difference, which seems to have been, from our perspective anyway, seems to have held fairly firm throughout most of the battle after the initial scuffles were taking place. So the advantage that the attackers gained was never really fought back on by Dorwinion. Though, like I said, I wouldn't be surprised if in that mid to late section of the game it went from being more extreme than that, and Dorwinion probably have brought it back a little bit. But not enough in the end, not enough. Wendy Pikes, the only ones. So CARAS SANT falls, and I guess considering the fact that the Rhovanion already seem to be vassalised by Rhun, Dorwinion would be finding themselves mostly surrounded. Only the riverside route leading back towards Dale and Erebor would have still been open, but inevitably, I guess, reinforcements from those two were not forthcoming. And as a result, Rhun, and by extension Sauron's power, has grown. Another good settlement, this though. Not too large, perfect really for the maximum contingent of players, because it is a fairly sizable settlement of course, but it's not so massive that it takes up the whole map and you get lost in it. I have to say that the design of a lot of these kind of settlements as well has been pretty good. The redesign of Mistran looks pretty great, hopefully we'll get to see that soon as well. The redesign of Khan Doom as well, which was never overly large and had its own distinct style anyway, but the redesign looks even better. So plenty of these capitals, obviously just mentioned the Runic and Angmarim ones, but plenty of these capitals now being realised as distinct settlements. CARAS SANT here, just the latest in the line of those that we've been able to see. But yeah, I think well deserved by the attackers in the end. They were able to really make use of everything, and it was looking a little bit dicey for them towards the end, but in particular with some of their individual units that they positioned, they were able to maintain the edge in terms of numbers that they had. But still, valiant effort from the defenders, and let's see what did the damage for these Dorwinion units. The Hammer Guard, like I said, maybe not much in terms of Eclipse's kills here, but I'm sure as we go down through, we'll see higher kill counts here, and the Hammer Guard ultimately were a very, very important aspect to the defenders here. That quality that they injected in to the late game was one of the things that allowed Dorwinion to look like they were maybe fighting their way back into a winning position. Morroquendi Pikes as well were another unit, probably the most important unit overall for the defenders here in terms of holding those lines. I mean, even in the sally out, they were pretty impressive for a relatively short amount of time, but still, the extra damage the Elven Pikes, I've been twittering on about that for a little while now, but the extra damage that those Pikes do tend to do does make a big difference, because Pikes are not well renowned for doing damage fast. So yeah, Elven Marksmen, some of them doing very, very well for themselves. For a more defensive unit of archers, that's impressive. Infantry, less so, but you wouldn't expect it considering the kind of armour-piercing force that Rhun is. Alexios' Hammer Guard breaking 300 kills, which is impressive. Like I said, Rhun did go for a more quality-centric army, so not many of those kills will be on lower-end units. Plenty of units breaking 100 as well, including Vinegard. Marksmen as well, Morroquendi bows. 110 maybe is a little bit disappointing considering what these kind of units are capable of doing. Cavalry, that's maybe one area where you would suggest that a lot of money was spent and not a huge amount of return was seen from stuff like the Morroquendi Glade Lords. Very expensive unit of cavalry, and we saw how to be a nuisance more effectively, I think, from the Rhovanion cavalry right at the end. We saw a little bit of that from the Glade Lords early on, but not to the extent that you would need considering the cost that's involved, so that's maybe one area where a change would have made all the difference. Glade Guard doing quite nicely, Tundra's Fox's army, Morroquendi Bows, once again, Hammer Guard. Decent returns from a lot of these units. Morroquendi Pikes once more, 258 on a unit of infantry is not bad, the rest of them a little bit underwhelming. Glade Riders again, only 7. Yeah, cavalry, a little bit of a concern. Morroquendi Bows 317, Hammer Guard. Not a huge amount of kills on the Hammer Guard, but it is worth saying that they were up against kind of equivalent units a lot of the time, and they were still able to do quite well for themselves. But yeah, to be fair, parity along much of these armies really. Many of the same units doing well, some of the same units being a little bit less impressive perhaps, but such is the way of things. But yes, big thank you to Eclipse for sending this one in. Always nice to see these new settlements get their time in the sun, a real representation of the kind of thing which hopefully we can see a lot more of moving forwards. And a big thank you of course as well to all the players that were part of this battle replay, many of them as well, or some of them part of the dev team. But yeah, nice to see. And hopefully again, like I said, we will be seeing a little bit more. There is another showcase I will be seeing, I think it's Fornost. It's an Arnorian settlement of some description similar to this, which I'll be hoping to record very, very shortly as well. So that will be another new patch preview that will be coming up. There will be as well a few more replays from the old version of the game as well on some custom settlements, which we'll be making our way through as well, one of which from Tommy, so that'll be good to see. And there will also, I think, be the necessity for a further channel update at some point in the course of the next couple of months. Again, it rather depends on when I'm going away and when I can find a good spot in the schedule to really hash out what my plans are going to be. But there does need, I think, to be a bit of a restructuring of the channel overall. Just because, again, it's been even more in survival mode over the course of the past couple of months than it has normally been, because I've been away for the maximum amount of time. And that's not likely to change for the foreseeable. So a little bit of a restructuring is going to be necessary, I think, just to make sure that things don't get stale and things don't get a little bit too overwhelming in that regard, from my perspective anyway, in terms of the workload. But we'll have to see on that. That's still something that I'm trying to sort of work through in my head to try and think of something that's sustainable. But again, that's something which will probably be happening probably towards the tail end of June. I think I'll probably have a better idea of what's going to be happening there. But yeah, like I said, big thanks to all the players, big thanks to Eclipse for sending this one in. I hope you enjoyed this, and hope you'll join me for whatever is next.